Hi everyone. Welcome to this course on sequencing informatics. And so the course will start with a couple of lectures by Fred LaPolla, who is going to teach you the R programming language. And then that will be followed by several lectures looking at how to use R to analyze sequencing data. So we will use Zoom for the lectures, and so you will ask to register each time so we can keep track of people. And also during the lectures, please mute yourself and switch off the video, because there's quite a lot of participants and we want to make sure that there is not a lot of background noise, and also that it doesn't slow down because if we use a lot of bandwidth. But if you have questions, you should definitely ask them using the chat. So there is a chat icon below on the lower side of the screen, and if you click it, the chat window will open up on the right side. So you should definitely use that, and we will try to answer your questions as soon as we can. For more complicated question, also for offline, we have set up Stack Overflow, where you can ask questions that are not during the lectures. So we will post the recording of these classes, so you can also, if you're not able to be here for the class, you can do it later. And then we will also do some polling just to find out how you're following the lectures. Okay, great. So Fred, go ahead.
Sure. And do we want the TAs to introduce themselves at all? We do have a handful of TAs who are here on the chat.
Yeah. So you can unmute yourselves and just...
Okay, yeah, and they're coming in on the chat as well. So they will be here today to answer questions as they're coming in. And again, for today's purposes, so that we don't have to look in too many places, especially if it's something, I mean, pretty much for today, because it's such a large group, we're going to ask that you kind of limit your questions to things that we're talking about immediately, that are immediately answerable with relation to what we're talking about in the moment. For longer term, or maybe not longer term, but for larger questions, we do have the Stack Overflow that David just mentioned. There's also in the chat up at the top, I've posted a link to join our Slack channel, which we're asking people to use if they want to interact with either myself or the TAs. So that way it's a little bit easier, since I think we have all had the experience that emails can quickly become difficult to sort of sort and keep things organized. But if you ask your questions.
Sorry, Fred. Yeah, preferably please avoid the email, actually.
Yes.
Because it's easy to get lost, and so use these ways to interact with us.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, so without further ado, my name is Fred LaPolla, and I'm a librarian here at the Health Sciences Library here at NYU Langone, working with our data services team. I've been using R in my own work for about 5 years or so, and I'll definitely say right off the bat, my background is not bioinformatics, and the sessions I'm going to be leading are really here to kind of get you off the ground so that you're able to then sort of dive into the more bioinformatics portions of this class. So this is really oriented towards an absolute beginner to sort of get you up and running. That said, if you're not an absolute beginner, hopefully there will still be useful information, but it is worth noting that this will be very beginner-oriented material. So maybe if it does feel too low level, maybe stay tuned and check in with us to sort of see when might be worth sort of dialing in. Also got open a tool called Mentimeter. And this is just basically another polling tool, which I like just because it sort of will free up our TAs and free up David to not have to worry too much about putting in questions. But to answer these, you just go to menti.com on your phone or on your computer, since everyone here is on a computer, and enter this code at the top. So just to try this out, let's see, I'm curious to know what the R experience in the room or in the metaphorical room that we have is. So again, just go to menti.com and try out this code. And I'll give everyone a few minutes. Okay, and this seems to be working pretty quickly, which is very nice. And very fortunate for myself is that it does seem like the vast majority are absolute beginners, which it's good. I will say, I mean, I definitely, first off, do want to say I appreciate you all taking time during this stressful time to come and learn a new skill and learn something about our programming. I don't want to sugarcoat that this can be very challenging for for people who are new to it. And it can be very, very frustrating, especially for people who are not used to working with this. A lot of people starting out are consistently surprised by the degree of time spent troubleshooting and getting errors and putting something in that seems like it should work, but then it doesn't for some reason. And I want to just encourage you to sort of stick with it through that experience that, to be honest, doesn't really go away. I think a major part of working in R, working probably in any sort of code-based work, is encountering errors and troubleshooting those errors. So it's definitely not you. It is just sort of the nature of the beast that you will definitely hit some errors. Okay, so my next question, I think, sort of skipping. So this question, actually don't answer this because we haven't talked about it yet. But one thing I didn't think to put in our poll is how many people may have the R and R Studio downloaded and working. And so you may have seen in the email, this is sort of a two-step process. So I'm hoping we can sort of, let's see, ask people in the probably not the chat, maybe in a poll. Let's see if I can get this going.
Yeah, I can ask
okay.
I can set that up.
So
you
yeah.
want to ask is separately if R is installed?
Really, I mean, if they have R Studio working, since you have to have R installed for that. So I have now, actually, I'm going to change this just to make it look a little bit more like it will look on yours. It occurs to me, whoops, preferences. So we'll talk about this in a minute, but you can have different backgrounds. And I should probably, for the sake of, consistency, just set it back to the basic one. Of course, now I'm forgetting which of these. Let's see if I just hit apply, will that go back? Okay, great.
Okay, so
it's slightly different colored, but it's not really worth worrying about. Yours will probably be black and white, sort of like this.
Can you see the poll?
Let's see, where would the poll live?
It doesn't look like anyone sees it. I did launch it.
Let me try.
No one has answered yet.
Yes, and I'm seeing that nobody is able to see it.
Okay.
Where would we be able to see? Do I need to stop sharing for this to work?
I don't think, the Python class, it worked. I don't know what is different now.
Okay.
And then we were able to share. I'm going to relaunch it and see what.
Okay. Oh, here it is. Now I'm seeing it. Did you successfully install?
Yeah, now people are starting to answer.
Okay. So we'll give everyone a minute or two. I know this is a very large group. And I guess just to sort of walk through the process. So it is really a two-step process. So you'll first need to go to R. So if you just Google R download, it would be the R project. And wait for this to load. What we're going to do is just find, as we scroll down, let's see, not seeing it there. On the left, download CRAN. CRAN is the sort of the organization that runs R and sort of maintains it, if that's the best way to put it. So we'll just find the US, but if you're abroad watching and tuning in, one, welcome, but two, feel free to find a location that's reasonably close to you. And you could go to that page of any of these, it doesn't really matter which one, and download for your operating system. So Linux users, Mac users, and Windows. Something I will note, which could be important or at least a little bit confusing, is that it will look a little bit different if you are on a PC today. I am on a Mac, so if things seem slightly different, that is likely the cause. And so it's looking like the vast majority do have it downloaded.
So it's only 22 that didn't. So that's
okay.
That's very good.
Excellent. I'm very glad to hear that. That is great because we will be trying out some hands-on things, and it will make a lot more sense if we look at things directly. So yeah, you'll first go here, and then we'll just go to RStudio, Google that, and download that for your operating system. Since it does seem like the majority do have it, I'm going to sort of just go ahead and jump into things. Okay, so hopefully by the end of the day, you'll really have a sense of what R is and why we're teaching this and learning it. Because I mean, it is, again, it's going to be more difficult than other options that may be out there, but I really do think there are a lot of benefits to using R as compared to other data analysis software and tools. Hopefully by the end, you'll be able to load a data set into R. We'll talk about what that actually means. Install packages and load them. So R is a tool that's really a code-based approach to data analysis. So it can be used for cleaning, analyzing, and publishing data. And throughout the course of the next few weeks, we'll really dive into what those terms mean. Something I'll note is my background. I sort of grew up, as it were, using spreadsheets, using things like Excel to organize data. So it tends to be useful to me to sort of think of that format of data, what is sometimes called tabular data, is kind of a jumping off point when thinking about R. So that will primarily be how I talk about and think about R. So you may have a different approach to thinking about that really clicks for you, but really for my purposes, I do tend to think about and talk about R in ways that are analogous to how we might talk about a spreadsheet. So it's a coding language specifically designed for data analysis. It's open source and free. So open source, meaning that people all throughout the world can download it for free. And they're building programs, sometimes whole suites of programs called packages that you can download. There's also a great deal of discussion online for how you can do different things down to very niche things, as well as very broad things. So that's one of the things that's very nice. That can cut both ways because sometimes you'll see solutions to problems that people talk about that maybe they created and then let languish and they're not really maintained and kept up to date. But in general, it can be very nice to be able to get all those answers without having to go to a proprietary source for information. So R is the language that RStudio is using. And RStudio, and here, I'll just pull it up just so everyone can see it. So it's called an integrated development environment. And basically that means it's a tool for working with R to make things a little bit easier for you. So you should, if you have RStudio open as opposed to just R, you should have something that looks more or less like this. I realize my colors are a bit off right now. Not going to worry about that too much for right now, but you should have 4 panes. You might only have 3, so it might look like this. And you can just change that by clicking on these double square boxes that appear on the corner. So that will be important. We'll walk through what each of these areas are shortly. But I do just want everyone to be on the same page, working in RStudio, not working directly in R. Directly in R, it would just look like this corner of the screen as though it was a standalone window. In my experience, very few, if any, people work directly in what's called the R console exclusively. Most people do work in RStudio because it is free and does have a lot of features that make it a lot easier for us to work with. So there are a lot of benefits to working with data in R as opposed to, say, a spreadsheet or some other tool. So one of the big things is all of you as scientific researchers are putting a lot of time and energy into actually collecting your data. I suspect many of you are coming from labs, and that's sort of why you're here today. So what you do not want to do is sort of mess with that data that you worked with and that was very arduous for you to collect. You want to leave that alone as much as possible. So if something does go wrong with your analysis, you can go back and get that original untouched data and not have to worry that, oh, I accidentally wrote over this cell. Is this what it said before? Or you hear these sort of famous cases where people working in Excel, it auto-corrects slightly, but it's too minute to really notice. So you don't have to worry about touching your actual data that's saved in a safe file elsewhere on your computer. You can also document the steps and automate things, as well as share with other users and say exactly, open this file, pull this data in, and run this. So from the standpoint of reproducible research, perhaps that's a term you've been hearing more and more. This can be really nice because it makes your studies more reproducible. For me, what really appeals to that, there is sort of the altruistic, better for science standpoint, but what this can be really nice is that it allows myself as an individual to be able to pull in analyses and do the same thing. So I primarily am using R personally for creating reports, often, user statistic type things of library things. I work in the library. And so it can be really nice to, rather than have to create these reports from scratch each time, I can just sort of download the survey results, say, run them through an R code that I've written at this point, months in the past, and then quickly generate a bunch of figures. So then I could put them, in a paper or in a report to hand off to whoever without having to reinvent the wheel. So often what we do, it will be perhaps, especially at first, it will feel slower than if you used a different tool. But I really do believe that once you get the hang of things, you'll find that it can really save you a lot of time down the road and make your work life a lot easier when it comes to analyzing things, especially if you tend to do similar sorts of analysis, but with updated data that you've collected. You can also maintain a history and version file. We'll talk about what that means in a little bit. So I'm going to go back actually to RStudio and just sort of quickly do a tour. And so some of the things are going to be very new jargon, and that's hopefully going to feel okay, but it will definitely be, a little bit of an adjustment at first. So there are these four windows basically on RStudio. Up here we have what is called the Scripting Pane. This is a place, I'll actually go File, and feel free to follow along, File, New File, RScript. This is a place where we can write code into the boxes. We could say 2 + 2, and then I can either highlight and hit on a Mac Command Enter, on a PC Control Enter, or if I'm on this line, I could also click Run. And then we see down here in this console, it gives me the result is 4. So it's not just understanding this as text that's readable, it is actively sort of processing this as instructions to the computer. Tell us what 2 + 2 equals. And down here, it's telling us it's 4. This area up here, the Scripting Pane, this is a place that we can write code and come back to and save it for later. In contrast, down here, we have what's called the console. It says console up here. And this is more, you could think of this as analogous to scrap paper, where we can do work in real time, but normally we wouldn't really be able to save it for later. So I could write 2 + 2, and if I hit Enter, I don't have to hit Control when I'm down here. It gives me 4, so I just hit Enter. The other thing that's nice down here is if I hit Up, it will just pull up my most recent commands. You can see I was working in R earlier. So if I just hit Up, I got 2 + 2 without having to type it out. Also, certain commands, if I start typing, let's say the command for median, I guess it's not, well, I got most of the way through median, but that's a relatively short word. It will pop up with suggestions. So often people will do kind of their scrap work, testing things out down here in this console. And then when they get a line that they like that works, they'll copy and paste it up here. So what they'll wind up with is up in the script, they'll have this set of instructions that is sort of all killer, no filler, just their instructions that they're telling the computer to run through to start, with pulling in their data and result with the analysis that they want. But for actually sort of figuring out what works and what doesn't, a lot of it will be done down here in this console, which again can be a little bit faster because it will offer, autofill for certain function names, as well as you can hit that up arrow again just to pull up this screen. Over here is something called the global environment. This is basically, as we go through working with R, we're going to give different things that we're working with, such as things like a spreadsheet of data, a table of data. We're going to give those names, and it will just tell us what data we've pulled into our project and what functions we may be working with, so that we can quickly reference them. And then down here is a sort of multi-panel tab. This is where, when we eventually make plots and figures, do data visualization, that will show up in this plots tab. There's this nice help feature, and we'll show how to use that in just a little bit. The packages that are installed with R, and we'll talk about what these mean, but they're basically collections of functions or collections of instructions for R to do different things. They can often be sort of specific to different fields and different tests, as well as a list of the files that are in our current directory. So I just use the word directory, and what that means, that's basically just computer jargon for a file folder. So things that you'll want to really know as we're working with R are, what is the directory, what is the file folder I'm working in, and how do I instruct R to look in certain file folders? What is the file path that's going to get me there? So yeah, scripts are basically a set of instructions and where we're telling R to do something. So here we've got a little bit of R's jargon, 1 through 10, 1:10, counts off every integer 1 through 10. We could then go a step beyond that. We could say, tell us the mean, and you note that we're then saying, with this function, we're putting the thing we want the mean of in a set of parentheses, and it's giving us back 5.5. As I mentioned, it can let you save things for later. Whereas that console, again, it's going to be more like the scrap paper that's more on the fly and a little bit quicker. There's also the ability to create what is called an R project. If I go back to R Studio, if I go back and say File, New Project, this can be a nice feature to be aware of. I'm actually going to hit cancel. Basically, we'll set up a file folder for us to work with so that all of the analysis files, all of the data that we've collected that we want to analyze in some way, are all together. We also have the ability to link it to a GitHub page, which can be nice. So it can be easier to automate and make your life easier down the line, since it knows to look for that data in the same file folder that you're working in. So I'm just going to jump ahead a little. So yeah, so working with R and GitHub, you can link your projects to a GitHub account. Not really going to go into that too much today. I think that will be something that may be discussed more down the line. But I do have some resources, and this should have been sent out, and if not, we can get it to you again. For if you really want to learn more about working with Git and including working with the command line, that is something you could explore on your own. Git is what's called a version control system. You can think of that analogous to if you've worked with Google Docs, like just a Word document in Google Drive. You can do a track changes there, and you can actually get back to older versions of your document. It's a similar sort of thing, but in Git, we say, we make these changes, we save them, and then we commit them. So we're saying we want to keep these changes for later. But again, not going to worry too much about that for today, because there are these resources that are really excellent for learning more about Git and GitHub. These things are separate. You can do Git just on your own, but GitHub is a website where people store and share code and track version changes to their projects. So it could be a great resource, especially if you have collaborators that you're working with on an analysis project. That way you can store all of your files in this one centrally located website. You can set it to be private or public, depending on your needs. And a lot of labs and departments have their own private GitHub page where they sort of store code for their departmental or team needs. And that can be very helpful for being able to directly pull code that your collaborators are working on and offer suggestions, and they can choose to accept them or not. That's called forking. Again, don't want to belabor GitHub too much today. Do want to try to stay focused on R and RStudio. So yeah, if you wanted to see mine, I've got some of these files up here on the option here. There should be things downloaded in the OneDrive folder for the person just speaking. But it will be primarily this actual page. So yeah, I'll be pulling directly at times from my own GitHub page, just because it makes life a little bit easier in terms of pulling in what are called CSVs, or spreadsheets, tables of data. That said, normally speaking, you don't necessarily have to work with GitHub at all if you don't want to. You could just pull in data from a spreadsheet on your local computer and work with it that way. Okay, so we talked about a bunch of things kind of quickly. I'm going to go to our next question in the polling software we have here. So if you want to save your code for later, would you do that in the console or the scripting panel? And just to show again, this is the console and this is the scripting panel up here. And it should be noted that by default, every line here is code. If we want to just make comments to ourselves in this scripting panel, we can do, we can do a hashtag. And now this is just text. So if I run this code, highlight it all, command enter, it does say that it did something, but it's not really executing anything. So it's giving us 4 in sort of this gray font and 9 in this gray font, but the red comment is just sort of in that greenish color. Okay, and it does seem like the vast majority of people have it, so that is great. Oh, and so, yeah, I mean, I guess I will say, so we just said that the comments are written with a hashtag, and so they are very good to be aware of because later on they will save you time. And I would strongly, strongly recommend that when you're writing code, you also add in comments. It can slow you down a little. You might feel like, oh, why do I need this? It's super obvious what I'm doing. In my experience, and in the experience of lots of my colleagues, you are definitely going to want to have comments because when you come back later, it is going to be arduous. Oops. All the wrong things on my screen at once. Here we go. Let's see. And just have to move the chat around. Apologies. Thank you all for bearing with me as sort of jump into this. So yeah, so truly the true correct answer here is going to be option D, because it will definitely save you time later as you go into your work. So I'm going to sort of jump into some of the commands. And a command, when I say command, that basically just means a set of instructions we're giving the computer to do something. So on a previous page, I had written 1:10, and that just meant count 1 through 10. And then we said mean in a set of parentheses 10, and that was telling the command, get the mean, get the average, the mean average of the numbers 1 through 10. And it gave that back to us. And here that is. So yeah, we just talked about this. Sorry, these seem to be a little bit out of order, but this is just a way of making things human readable. You might note the file that I actually had at the beginning of the class on my screen, this RMD file, .rmd, we can see up here. This is what's called a markdown file. This is sort of, I'm putting the cart in front of the horse a little bit by talking about this, but just so you're not confused if you are looking at this, this is a sort of a presentation tool. It's called a markdown file. And these slides that we're looking at in the web browser were used directly from R. And so here, when they have a hashtag, it means it's sort of a header, but you don't really need to worry about that for today. Just if you're confused, why is the file that I'm showing some things with using hashtags and they show up as headers, and why is it elsewhere going to be a comment? That is the reason. A .r file is different from a .rmd. And for today, we're just going to worry about a .r, a regular R script file. So sometimes, and actually I'd say frequently, we're going to want to give things names. So by names, we'll be naming variables. We can name entire tables of data. We can name lists. We could write our own functions if we want, and name those. And the way we would do that is we would use this assignment. It's the left pointing arrow, so above the comma on my keyboard, and then a hyphen. So it looks a little bit weird on this screen. I'll just go in and I'll type it over here. So let's say we talked about the numbers, doesn't really matter, 1 through 10. Let's say I wanted to create a variable so I could refer to this later. I can hit the left arrow and then a hyphen. We could also, there's a keyboard command of, let's see, is it command minus, no, command alt, whoops. That's to make things smaller. Oh yeah, so it's just on my computer, Alt or Option, and then the hyphen, and that creates that. And we can give it some name. So I'll just call it 1 to 10. This cannot begin with a number. And in general, you want to stick with sort of standard text uses. So now I'm going to run this line. And now over here in that environment, it's told me I've got this value, this list basically of the numbers 1 through 10. And this is really nice. This is a nice feature of RStudio that it tells you all of the variables that you've created. So you can sort of refer back to them and say, okay, that is something I can work with, or, oh, I have not yet loaded in my table of data because it's not showing up in my global environment. Some people do use an equal sign, a single equal sign. I am going to say I sort of recommend that you not do that. The convention in R is to use the arrow, this arrow here. And the reason is it can get a little bit confusing, in part because some functions or some commands use equals as part of their command. It's not sort of redefining things. So sometimes you might say, run some algorithm and the size of this, the n of this algorithm is equal to something. And that might use a single equals. So it can kind of become confusing if you're using it in two different ways. The other reason, I think it legitimately is the case that the convention is the arrow. So I would just, as somebody using R, sort of recommend sticking with what others are doing commonly. You could also, if you wanted to, though I've never actually seen anybody do this in practice, you can assign things in a rightward direction, but you'd normally not want to do that. But just to really belabor the point, what this is doing is it's saying, take these things over here and just call them this. So now if I was to write this out, has to be the same capitalization. Capitalization does matter. And let's say we did mean, and we remember earlier I wrote median. I can now run this command, and now we have it, did I get it? Median 1 to 10, 5.5. Is that right? It seems right. So it can be something good to just be aware of, that you can assign these names. And in this case, it's such a simple example, you probably wouldn't need a variable. But sometimes when we have a whole table worth of data, you're really going to want to have a name so you can refer to it and refer back to it. Same basic thing. Whoops. So I'm going to go over to Mentimeter again. So what is a variable when we're talking about variables? Is a variable a name for an object like a table of data that can be used for running commands in that table? Are they used only in math equations? Or do they hold values that change as other values change, such as x equals y times 2? Excellent. I'm seeing the vast majority of people, it seems like everybody's getting it for the most part. So yeah, it's going to be the name of an object or something that we're working with in R. The shortcut command for that, if you want to do it on a Mac, is Alt minus, Option minus. And in general, not just with regards to the keyboard shortcuts, but most things that we're going to work with, I would strongly recommend becoming very comfortable just Googling things. I would say the vast majority of these, so we'll talk about through the course of this, kind of a lot of different functions that are available, and really nobody memorizes all of them. You know, some that you find yourself using all the time in your work, sure, you'll just memorize from experience. But in normal usage, a lot of us just will not remember these things. I mean, I definitely don't. And frankly, there's no need to. That is why tools like Stack Exchange, we'll talk about some of the others, things like R bloggers, and so I have a whole bunch written down at the end that will be good just to be aware of, since it's just too much to remember. And it's not necessary. It's just not how people do this kind of work. Okay, so one of the first things to make R actually useful to work with is we're going to want to somehow pull in data. So we've done our experiment in the lab. We've in some way collected data. Maybe we've run our processes, and now we have these uncorrected gene expression figures, and they're coming back to us. But now we need to actually be able to pull them in, since they're in some some file somewhere. Maybe they're just in a giant .txt file. Maybe they're in a CSV file. I'm going to talk about right now CSV file. It stands for comma separated value. It's basically a very low tech spreadsheet, very low Excel spreadsheet type thing. Your data, it might come back in text files, but the same general processes will apply. Similarly, we could pull in things, let's say there was data on a website that was in like a SAS file. We wanted to pull that in. There are ways we could work with that. But for right now, I'm going to sort of use the CSV as a jumping off point because it tends to be a pretty common and it is low tech sort of file. It's basically a spreadsheet that if you opened it in a text editor, instead of actual columns, it would have commas between them, hence the name comma separated values, and then in each row. So it's, if you have Excel installed on your computer, typically it will open in Excel, but you do not actually need Excel to view it. And sometimes it will open in all sorts of weird programs since it is just kind of this low tech file. So I mentioned earlier from a reproducibility standpoint, this is really nice because any changes we make are going to leave our data unharmed and unchanged. Whereas, if you're doing analysis in actual, say, Excel as an example, you have to change the values of the cells as you're working through it. So unless you save a new file each time, you run the risk of sort of overwriting your raw data. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy and paste some of these things. So my computer already has what's called the package rcurl. And there's a few different ways. Whoops. Sorry. So I'm just going to highlight this. And I'm going to go to RStudio just to show what it looks like. So I talked about packages. Maybe I'll just do it down here in the console just to make life a little bit easier. Maybe I'll make this bigger. Oops. Saying at the bottom. So if So I'm going to just enable rcurl. That's basically a tool that somebody built for R that says we can go to a website. In this case, I'm going directly to my GitHub page to download this directly and using the URL. And if I run this, now I have this file over here, NYC. An alternate way we could do this is if you say you went to the OneDrive page and downloaded that page. So there's a question of, do you need to have a module loaded to be able to download GitHub? So you do have to install rcurl to do it that way. But another option for today, since I'm less worried about having people understand how to pull things off the internet, is let's say you went to that OneDrive page and I have it open right here. I'm just gonna click on this to download this. Whoops, that's the syllabus, click the wrong thing. NYC Haynes, this is actual data. It's a sort of a subset of a larger study, the New York City Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, I believe. And this has sort of been narrowed down. It is admittedly perhaps a little more clinical than what many people may be working with. Let's see. Download. So now that'll be in my downloads folder. I don't even really need to open it. It is admittedly more clinical than you may be used to working with. The reason I'm choosing it is A, it's freely available, but B, and more importantly for our purposes in this section of the workshop of the class, is it has different types of data. And by different types of data, I mean, if I go back into it, it's got this key, which is just sort of it might as well be people's names. It happens to be numbers with a letter, but it could be names and so on. Going over, it has things that are sort of categorical variables, and we'll talk more about what types of data R can work with and likes to work with, and how they're sort of phrased in the R jargon as we go forward. But things that are categorical values, so things like an age group. It has raw numbers. Those are pretty much the main things in here. But basically, I chose it because it has different types of data. So going back to R. So down here, we had this read.csv. I'm actually going to go in, and we could even, I first would want to find out what is my working directory, which is often a nice step to do. So if I'm in the console, I can type get wd, And again, that just stands for what is the file folder that I'm working in. It says I'm in my documents folder. So there's a few different ways I could choose to work with this. I could put in here, I could say read.csv, and then I could put the file path, or basically the instructions. So I could start at the whole C:/ that sort of information. But if I say users, LaPolla F01, and I already know just from this being my computer that the folder is called downloads, that's where it downloaded to. But if I didn't want to type this out, I could also go up to the session menu, set working directory, so set the file folder that we're going to work from, and choose directory here. And I could find it's currently on my documents folder. I could go to my top level one. I can go over here to downloads and so on. I actually do kind of like, though, having it written out in the code. The reason for that being is then I won't, if I decide to rerun this, I won't have to go in manually and set the working directory. I can just tell it, go to the downloads. So in my life, that matters because often I'm pulling data from surveys, that sort of data, that are downloading to my computer. So it's very nice to have it in the downloads. You may be pulling it from different areas. So you might always, somebody might always, for example, be providing access that you're then clicking from a shared cloud drive and pulling it down. So then the last step is just gonna be the file name of it. Diab, because it's sort of the diabetes subset. And if we do this, it's giving me some problem. No file exists. Of course. I mean, I already have it in, which is sort of nice. It's just download. I also know it is in the documents because I've been working with this a lot in preparation of this. Of course, there's some sort of issue. Oh, is it user? So it's very, finicky with typos. In any event, I'm not going to worry about it too much. That is sort of why I had, provided myself with that URL to pull in, because I did want to be able to get it. So some things to note, unable to see the code. Let's see, what is a better option? Appearance. Of course, don't really remember. That looks like that'll be better. Maybe higher res. Is it? Yeah, it looks a little more higher res. So yeah, I apologize for that. So hopefully this is slightly more usable, user-friendly. It is, of course, a little bit difficult to find the optimal screen. That is something worth noting. If you want to change your own preferences for displays, up here on the left, this preferences menu on a Mac, it's probably under the edit menu on a PC, though don't hold me to that. But if you go to preferences, you can set those display things here just for your own future use. So in any event, so over here now, after we've pulled this in, we do have this data, this object here. It's telling us 1527 observations. So basically 1527 rows, and then 23 variables. I will, let's see, I will go up and say, if you're getting instructions from OneDrive that it's not letting you do it, I will say, go to, if you can see this, I'll leave this on this for a few minutes. And I realize it's not the most convenient to do this, to type this out. But you could type this out and this will also pull it in if your OneDrive isn't working today. But some things to note. So there's 1527 observation or rows of 23 variables, so 23 different columns. If we really wanted to see it, we could go ahead and just click on this. If we note it ran a command called view, this will probably not often be the most useful way to get a sense of your data, but sometimes it can be nice just to make sure, did it read in at all, or is it just going to be a field of NAs? It can be nice just to click on it or write capital V, view, NYC. And now we have what looks essentially equivalent to that same Excel spreadsheet. So just a table of our data. So I will definitely say this will be, yeah, I'll put the code in the chat. A very common first, change the everyone, it started chat direct. Let's see. So yeah, hopefully you can copy and paste that into your code, and hopefully it doesn't do weird things. Sometimes going between different tools, it may pick up artifacts, it may pick up weird things. So like if I had written this in a Word document and copied and pasted it back, I'm almost certain the quotation marks would get weird from the standpoint of R, because quotation marks in Word are formatted in such a way that they might do a little bit more than just look like these kind of very basic things. Okay, I'm gonna go back to my browser, back to my slides. So yeah, so there's definitely a lot of types of data that you may want to try. So we're not really gonna break out, but I will recommend you try out on your own later, creating a new R project to see what goes into that, giving it a file name that makes sense for you. Try creating a variable, maybe a list of numbers 10 through 20, and also try out pulling in data. So I've actually already given a solution here that may work, though it's formatted very strangely for whatever reason. And yeah, so we're not going to spend the time today working on that since we have relatively short time, but I will make sure that you all have access through OneDrive to be able to access these sort of tasks to try out at home. So far we've tried out pulling in our data, and I'm hopeful that that will become a very comfortable action. Something else which I did not mention but is very helpful to be aware of, I'll go back to my sort of script, my blank script, is so we ran this command read.csv. And this is an example of a command that will probably become very second nature to you. But often when we're learning things, we're trying out new things, we may, let's see, okay, so there's a question on locating the session directory. The easiest way to do that is to type in get wd in the console and open close parentheses, and that tells you what file folder, and it gives it to you in this kind of computer jargon. So on this computer, this is like a Langone laptop that I have. It says users, LaPolla F01, so that's just my KID, and then documents. And if I was to open up the Finder, I'm on a Mac, so it would be the Explorer if you're on a Windows option. Let's see, it always looks a little bit weird. Oh yeah, down here we can see that there's this documents folder, and I know there's a way I can make this look like with the slashes. I don't want to get too bogged down on this, but you can view it that way. I always find it's actually a little bit more straightforward on a PC actually, but in any event, finding that path and getting that way. So definitely read.csv will be something we talk about a lot, other things, but if you're ever not sure about a function you've seen, a nice feature is if I do question mark read.csv, question mark the name of the function, it's even suggesting it up here, and hit enter. Over here on the right in this help menu, now it has a read.table command. So read.csv is sort of what's the word? A set of sort of a family of commands that we might give to R. So read.table is sort of the top level one, but then we see it has instructions. And so something that really over time you'll become familiar with. And unfortunately, it kind of comes down to just copying what other people do to get the sense of what you need, is that there will be certain arguments, so certain parts of this function. So the function is read.csv, and things like file, header equals true, separation is a comma, so on, are arguments. Some, and in fact, most of these are optional. So we will need the file. We do want to say, download the NYC Haynes .csv. The header that's saying is the top row, is that data or is that description? So if we looked again at that, we could see age group, that's not actual data, that's a description of the data that comes underneath it. So we do want header is true, that is the default, so we don't have to worry about it. But sometimes, and actually for those of you who are going to be doing RNA-seq and working with like gene expression, often that top row will just be some number that actually is data. So in that case, you're really gonna wanna make sure header equals false. And yeah, the things like if there's different separators, so this is a comma separated value, so it's fine. Sometimes you'll have things where it's a .txt file. Maybe you've gotten it back from, you've put it through like a processor, and instead of commas, it used tabs to separate the columns. So just, you'll have to sort of specify there. But I'm not really saying that so that you'll memorize what are the arguments that read.csv takes. I'm saying that so you'll remember if you're in doubt or you're encountering a new command that you don't know what it is, question mark the name of that command. So question mark read.csv. If I did question mark mean, I'm not sure this will be so interesting. Yeah, it tells us the mean. Is a great way to get a sense of what is this function, what is this command, and what does it roughly do? Especially because, in the case of mean, maybe that's obvious. Sometimes, and especially as you move on to the kind of bioinformatics options, they might not be so straightforward in their names, or at least not the first time you're seeing them. Okay. And there was a question, is there a list? I do not think there is any centralized list just because there are so many, because it is open source. And frankly, I could, if I wanted to, write my own package and give it names. And as we'll see as we move on, so there are these packages in R, they may use the same names as other packages. So a feature that might be nice with MATLAB that's all owned by whoever owns MATLAB is the functions should all have independent names. Whereas as we'll see, we'll have names of functions that do the same thing, but with different packages, depending on if they're loaded. And for those of you who may not be aware of what I mean, no need to worry about that too much for right now. So when I say packages. So we'll pull in our data, and then we're going to want to get a sense of that data. We're going to want to know what's in there. And eventually, we're even going to need to get some sort of descriptive statistics so that we know what sort of analysis is even, for example, available to us. Is our data, for example, normally distributed, or is there skew? That's going to matter. So we're going to want to try to get a quick sort of flavor of our data. So one option is you could try, so as mentioned earlier when we clicked on it, it ran view. Another option that might be a little bit more manageable is if we do head NYC. And it looks a little bit weird because it has sort of forced everything to fit within this width. Whoops, sorry, on the sort of weird trackback. But we can see it's saying the first column is key, and it has these things, gender, SV age, and it has the first 6 or so observations, 6 or so rows of our column. And we can kind of just quickly get a sense. This is really, again, mostly going to be helpful if we're just trying to sort of see what have we loaded in. Not so much if we want to really understand our data. Another option that might be nicer in that case is called summary. So if I did summary NYC, and here I'm just going to sort of stay on this slide. What this does is it's going to actually provide us different information based on the different type of data that is in our table that we've pulled in. What I guess I should probably at this point just start calling this a data frame, use R's jargon so it feels more comfortable. So this spreadsheet is called, we could call it a data frame if we want to sound like our programmers. And so here it's saying this key, it has one of each, so it's not that interesting because the key is basically functioning as it should with unique identifiers. So you could think of that as analogous to, say, the gene names if you were doing gene expression. Going over, it looks to me like it's actually miscategorized gender. Because it's providing us information on median and mean. So it just thinks these are straight ahead numbers, whereas in fact, these will be categorical variables. Age, it is treating as a number, so we can see it's going 20 to 97. Age group, it's doing the same thing. Even the name implies these are not numbers in the sense of that we could add them together, that they have coded people in one age bracket are ones, and then it looks like another age bracket are twos, and another age brackets are threes. And so on. And then these things, various levels of various chemicals that are maybe in urine levels that could be relevant to diabetes diagnosis, as well as things like smoking status if we scroll down, through this. So again, it's going to provide us different information based on the type of values in that column. And so things like numbers, it's going to give us the quartiles and the median and so on, as well as the NAs. Things like things like character values, it's just going to tell us how many of each there are. And that would be the case if these were categorized as categorical, but unfortunately it has misread them in. And in general, we will talk about ways to get things on the right page if they are not what we are expecting when we go through. There are even more, sort of niche things that might be useful. So we could try one from the psych package, which I like. So we could try this one called describe. So I mentioned earlier, somebody in the chat had asked about the functions that come from MATLAB. And so because R is open source, when we want to do a specific function that comes from a specific package, we have to load that package. So if we've never worked with it before, I don't like how gray that is. Maybe if I do it up here, install.packages, and in quotes, PSYC. If I hit enter, it's going to, down here, we see there's a little stop sign. If you have a function that is never ending and it's like there's some problem, you can hit stop. It sort of pulls the brakes on things. Strictly speaking, there is sometimes the potential for creating a function that has no end. And so that might be, I've never personally really run into that in R per se, but if you did have that issue, you could hit stop. It almost always gives you some warning. It's saying it's not available, but I'm pretty sure it is already installed. So I'm not going to worry about that for the moment, but often you will get a bunch of information about why it's not working. Library psych. I wonder if it needs a H, but we can just try running it. Whoops, I misspelled it. That's a good, oh, there is an H. So I already have it installed, so that's why it was being weird. And there is an H. So just for future reference, if I run this, and let's say I want to do describe NYC, and let's say I don't want to do everything, I can do a $sign and that name of that column. So we'll just say lead. And down here, it's giving us the results. So this could be nice. We can see the skew is 5.79. So this is not a normally distributed value. So it could be good just to be aware that these sort of more, as well as things like the standard deviation and so on, statistically maybe interesting values are provided to give us a little bit more detail than we were getting just with the summary. Always, there's going to be lots of different ways you can do pretty much the same thing. So there's another package called PasteX, and I'm really mostly at this point just sort of noting that in the course of your work, you may see more than one way to do a thing in R. And it's good just to be aware that there will be things that inevitably appeal to you. This one, it's presenting in sort of scientific notation. I don't love that. So actually on the next slide, I added a command around it called round, which conveniently rounds it to 2 decimal places. And we can see here, now it's giving us similar information. So we have the standard deviation and so on, but rounded to a more manageable number. So a lot of different ways. I see someone's asking, what is $lead? So what the dollar does is it says, go to that specific column. So if we go back here, I'm gonna run a command called names of NYC. It's telling us these are all the top of the column names of each column. And so if I say NYC, I'll do it up here because again, that contrast is not ideal. Dollar, so I did lead, but let's say I did A1C to get the A1C level, which is a level, oh, it's just pulling up everything. I should have done something like describe or mean. It's basically saying, go to NYC, go to the column that is named A1C, and then do whatever. In this case, because I just ran it, it just printed everything. But if I went up and I said describe A1C, command enter.
Sorry, Fred, we're sort of getting close to the hour. So
sure.
I don't want to go too far.
Sure.
And also, maybe should we run the poll again just to check how many people have, we can have the same question asking how many people now have RStudio installed.
That sounds great. So yeah, let's do that. And we'll sort of pick up here next time, which will be Tuesday.
Can you see the poll? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I can see the poll.
Yeah, good.
So yeah, if people can fill this out, that will be huge. Similarly, if you have questions, we definitely prefer either Slack or the Stack Exchange link for figuring things out. We'll be happy to try to help you to the best of our ability. It is admittedly always a little bit challenging when sort of at remote to provide tips and feedback. The other thing I will note is the number one issue people have in R is typo related, is very fussy about what's the word? Specifically having all the spelling being the same. So any small thing, an accidental capitalization, a stray comma, will typically cause some sort of error. Definitely don't view this as a failure on your part. It's a very common experience. We will, so next time when we start, we'll sort of jump off talking a bit about indexing, what's called indexing, so accessing rows and columns, and we'll talk more about packages that will be of use as we go forward. But yeah, for right now, we're really just sort of jumping off and getting started. So it looks like the vast majority do have it installed, which is excellent. If not, definitely let us know in Slack. Maybe even if you're getting some sort of error, maybe screenshot that error so we can hopefully try to understand more. The more information you can provide about your error, so even like what operating system, what type of computer, what happened when you tried to install it, and so on, the more we'll be able to help you. So it's after 4. I want to thank you all, and I definitely want to thank our TAs for doing an amazing job on answering questions. Definitely you can feel free to DM me on Slack or ask any of the TAs or write a question in the channel. And ideally, we'll get to a point where everybody is sort of, a peer able to sort of troubleshoot problems together, since that is such a part of this. So thanks, and have a great evening. And since we're not meeting until next week, have a great weekend. And also stay safe, and I hope you and your families are all well.